And so next up, podcast listeners, one of my favorite comedians, and he's actually on the left, tells you that we are critical thinkers and we have diversity of thought on Mark and the Millennials, is Bill Maher. And he talks about, in this segment, Democrats ignore COVID science. And it's about all of the lockdowns and how they have been counterproductive and how the media has lied to so many of us, depending on the media that you're watching. Also, people are hysterical because they don't really have the information, because the media hasn't provided them the information, because they have made COVID science political, which is precisely Maher's point. So we have, first up, Mark brings a conclusion about COVID science and also the COVID issues and the media. We have a series of clips on this, and here's the first one.
But what about liberals? You know, the high information by the science people? In a recent Gallup survey, Democrats did much worse than Republicans in getting the right answer to the fundamental question, what are the chances that someone who gets COVID will need to be hospitalized? The answer is between 1% and 5%. 41% of Democrats thought it was over 50%. Another 28% put the chances at 20 to 49. So almost 70% of Democrats are wildly off on this key question and also have a greatly exaggerated view of the danger of COVID-2 and the mortality rate among children. All of which explains why today the states with the highest share of schools that are still closed are all blue states.
Exactly. And if you ever walk down a sidewalk in a blue city, you will find out that people look at you really funny if you're not wearing a mask. And they will literally cross the street to go to the other side of the sidewalk. I mean, my son and I were walking down the street in a town that is a blue town, and we actually had people yell at us. They were, I'd say, 65, 68, yelling at us because we were not wearing masks and they were wearing masks. And she said, "Wear a damn mask." I mean, that's what the lady yelled at. I mean, how ladylike is that? And of course, what you want to yell back is, and we didn't, is why are you outside if you're so terrified? If you think that mask is going to save you outside of all places, then you might want to just stay home. And obviously, it's absurd that someone would do that, but nonetheless, that's what they did. So we have a couple more clips from Bill Maher. He really brings us home. And he brings lots of conclusions and talks about lots of conclusions about COVID science and the blue states versus the red states, and the fact that people were listening to CNN and MSNBC, and they were believing what they were saying, and that's why they were locking themselves down and terrified and doing great harm to themselves and to their families, and most definitely to their children. We have that clip, and here it is.
So if the right-wing media bubble has to own things like climate change denial, shouldn't liberal media have to answer for, how did your audience wind up believing such a bunch of crap about COVID?
So that clip is a setup. It's a setup for the remaining two clips in this series, this segment, where he talks about beaches being dangerous and compares Florida to New York and how infection rates went down in Texas. So you got to listen to this. We have that clip. Here it is.
A new report in The Atlantic says the media won't stop putting pictures of the beach on stories about COVID, even though it's looking increasingly like the beach is the best place to avoid it. Sunlight is the best disinfectant, and vitamin D is the key to a robust immune system. Texas lifted its COVID restrictions recently, and their infection rates went down, in part because of people getting outside to let the sun and wind do their thing.
It's called vitamin D, right? Being outside, it's actually good for you to be outside. And it's probably equally good for you to not wear a mask outside so that your face can get the full benefit of fresh air and the full benefit of the sun, and as well as your body. And the thing is, I feel like all Americans already knew this, but instead of using their common sense, instead of actually reading, they just watch CNN and MSNBC and just got more and more terrified and locked themselves down. And as Maher said, in Texas, infection rates went down when the lockdowns were lifted, and they were lifted very early, earlier than most every other state. And so that's contrary to common sense, right? Because we were told if you locked down, you wouldn't get COVID. Of course, you would get COVID if you were locked down, if you were in an apartment building and there were 1,000 other people in there and someone had COVID, and the chances of that were pretty high. And it did happen that way. And so finally, Maher says, keep politics out of it. Why do we have politics involved in science, in healthcare? Well, I know why. Because Democrats wanted to win the presidency and they got their way. And we had that final clip of the segment, and here it is.
But to many liberals, that can't be right, because Texas and beach-loving Florida have Republican governors. But life is complicated. I've read that the governor of Florida reads. I know we like to think of Florida as only middle school teachers on bath salts having sex with their students in front of an alligator. But apparently the governor is also a voracious consumer of the scientific literature. And maybe that's why he protected his most vulnerable population, the elderly, way better than did the governor of New York.
That's for sure. That's for sure.
Those are just facts. I know it's irresponsible of me to say them. Look, here's what I'm saying. I don't want politics mixed in with my medical decisions.
Amen to that. No politics in medical decisions. No politics whatsoever should be involved in this COVID nightmare that we've been in. But that's all that MSNBC and CNN and CBS and ABC and NBC decided to get involved in, because they wanted to defeat Donald Trump and they wanted to defeat the Republicans in Congress. And they got their way, didn't they? They got their way because the Democrats won both houses in Congress, and they also won the presidency. And now, who's in charge? The same people that politicized it, and people are still terrified, because you have to keep them terrified to keep them, locked down and afraid of actually going out and living their lives. And so to prove that point with the vaccine, we've even heard, of course, Fauci say, well, even after you're vaccinated, you should still wear a mask, and you should really be afraid, to interact with people. By definition, I don't know about you all out there in podcast land, but by definition, I always thought that the word vaccine meant you're safe, right? You're vaccinated means you're safe. Nothing further can happen to you with respect to that bad thing that you just got vaccinated against, but not according to Fauci, which makes you wonder if the scientists aren't following the science too, or if we're just being lied to. Who knows? But we can only hope that we have a media that's independent and critical thinkers and try to help us with that. So only vaccinated Bills fans, according to the Buffalo News, can attend games this fall. The full-throated roar of Buffalo Bills fans may be heard during next season's games at Highmark Stadium, but only if they are vaccinated and can prove it. The same goes for next season's Sabre games. Our goal is to have a 100% full house for the Bills and the Sabres starting in the fall, Erie County Executive Mark Palankar said Tuesday's weekly briefing. So why does that matter? Well, it matters because we know that young people really shouldn't get vaccinated because they have a strong immune system. So are they not going to be able to get in? Are they going to be denied because they don't have vaccination cards? In fact, just the other day, I met someone in my office because they had made an appointment to meet me to discuss different things. They came into my office and they were wearing a mask, and the first thing they said to me was, "Are you vaccinated?" And I said, "Well, no, I'm not vaccinated." And they said, "Well, why?" And I said, "Well, because I had COVID just not that long ago." And much to my surprise, when I called my doctor to tell him, the doctor said, "Don't get the vaccine, by the way, for at least 90 days, and don't get the second vaccine ever." Well, I'm like, well, where do I get that information? And so I tell this to this individual who's hysterical about COVID, but is indeed vaccinated and still wearing a mask. I mean, what the heck, right? She's vaccinated, she's wearing a mask, and she's worried that I'm not vaccinated. Well, by definition, if you're vaccinated, then that means that you have this get out of jail free card. You're not going to get COVID anymore. COVID's not going to attack you. That's what I was taught the word vaccine means. But that's why I'm so glad that Bill Maher, who's on the left as a comedian, is sick and tired of this nonsense and is finally talking about it. And so are so many others. And they're doing it primarily, by the way, on podcasts because the mainstream media won't cover them at all. And that is Democrats ignore COVID science.